Hey everyone, thanks for joining our live streaming session on steps to prevent ransomware. I'm excited to welcome our cybersecurity experts today, Andy Ruse, Director of Information Security at Meriplex, and Jon Villanti, SVP of Information Security at Allegiance Bank. I'm going to kick this off to Andy now to get us started.
Okay, thank you, Macy, and thank you, Jon, for being here. We have a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started with our conversation. I'm not sure if you guys have followed our videos, but this is kind of the representation of the anatomy of a ransomware attack that we normally use to kind of represent on the different things that we want you to be aware. And today we're going to focus on prevention. And we're going to kind of break this in different aspects and different sections of what happened when there is a ransomware attack. And again, just remember that this is a kind of a picture that we're going to use as a representation of the different phases. We have the initiation phases, then we have the malware phase, and then we have the communication phase. And we're going to get deep in each of these phases and how they represent kind of how a normal ransomware will work. Jon, anything to add on that?
No, I think it's really important for the viewers to use this slide as the blueprint for the rest of the presentation, because we're going to break this down into the building blocks of a ransomware attack and talk about prevention at many different layers across the attack.
Yep. Thank you for that, Jon. Okay, so we're going to first start with the initiation. So this is where everything starts, right? So we want you to be aware of what key things you can do to prevent, again, one more time, this particular step. And as we talked in our previous video, there's normally two big components of the initiation. One is that phishing email that's going to come to your users with spear phishing or maybe just phishing. And the second type is when you have a vulnerability that these attackers are able to exploit. So on the first side, on the phishing side, one of the important things that your organization should be doing is the user training, the end user education, something that we normally would call the security awareness and training for the users. A lot of these phishing emails are going to go directly to them, and some of them, are going to be more clear than others to pretty much the users to understand if that's a legit email or not. But you have to educate your users to kind of look for those variables, look for, the spoofing email, look for certain things that are going to give them a clue that this is coming from outside, or this is coming with malicious intent. Now, something that companies will do is they will kind of evaluate their clicking rate, and this is something, again, that we have seen around as being an average of 3% for a mature organization. But when I talk about these things, we say we don't need 3%, we need one click, and that's the sad part, right? So you don't need a 3% of users being able to click that phishing email. You just need one user, and that's where the risk is. That's why the user education, the user training is super important. And use the phishing campaigns to enforce that education. The phishing campaigns sometimes are incorrectly understood of a way of punishing people. That's not the purpose. The purpose is for you to educate your people, and the purpose is to make sure that they understand on what variables they should take in consideration whenever they're seeing these emails. The second thing is the anti-phishing solution. Pretty much every organization right now, they will have some solution that they use for anti-phishing. And on these things, there's a lot of things that you can do that are default. For example, the DMARC configuration is something that normally you will have to do, no questions there. But also, if you see an email coming from the outside, you can put a small subject saying, hey, be aware of links and attachments of this email because it's coming from the outside. Things to help your users to pay more attention to those things. And the last thing is make sure that you configure that properly. A lot of these anti-phishing solutions have many features. Take advantage of those. Take advantage of the white list, the black list, and keep maintaining those. Some of our customer requests the users to pretty much be able to spot phishing emails and elevate that, saying, hey, I think this is a phishing email, and that will automate that domain or that email to be pretty much blocked across the board when you mark it as a possible phishing email. Now, On the other section that we talk about vulnerabilities, and we talk about how to exploit those vulnerabilities. And one of the major things that you should be doing is patch management. You should be doing vulnerability management, and a key portion of that is your patch management. We talk about the key vulnerabilities that have been used in the last year or in the last 2 years to pretty much exploit your ransomware. Sadly, we still see port 3389 open, RDP port open in a lot of servers that have not been patched in years. And that's something that we have to explain users, that there is a lot of vulnerabilities related to that port, related to Windows servers normally that people can take advantage and exploit. And be aware that within that vulnerability management and inside your patch management process, you have something related to emergency patches. If there is something that comes as a 0-day with a critical vulnerability, keep an eye on those and give them priority.
Yeah, and I'd like to talk about, just when it comes to phishing your own users and creating that level of user awareness, it isn't about the punishment, right? So we can view things through two lenses, right? The carrot and the stick. And we really want to put that stick away and let people know that we're not trying to fool them and make them feel badly because we phished them and they clicked, but rather we're really, as an organization, we need to assess the true risks that technology and users pose to the business. And Andy talked just about patch management. Well, we have very robust vulnerability management programs with vulnerability scanners and remediation SLAs and things of that like. And just as we scan our technology for weaknesses, we have to do the same with our users. And that's why we should be phishing our users. And just one tip, personal opinion, is that you really need to use the phishing emails directed towards your organization as a source of internal threat intelligence. And once you understand the themes and overtones of the phishes you're getting, use those same themes in the phishing tests that you conduct with your end users. You really need to build the right type of immunization against the types of threats you're facing. It doesn't make a lot of sense for me to phish my users with a themed message on an Amazon gift card if those aren't the types of phishing messages we're getting inside the bank.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you, John. So again, we are going to separate the conversation on prevention, and this is kind of what happened in the initiation of the attack, of the ways of entry of the attack. So now, John, why don't you talk a little bit about how that happened, what happened after that initiation step?
Yeah, so if we think about, prevention, of course, is ideal. Detection is a must. But if we think that maybe the prevention of the delivery failed, we're now into, so the user might have clicked a link, they might have opened a file which contains some sort of a payload, contains some sort of malware. Now, from an attacker perspective, they're trying to get that malware not only delivered to your endpoint, but to be executed on your endpoint. And I think of this in layers. And what really, the big takeaway from this slide is it illustrates a defense in depth strategy at many boundary layers as that malware transits from its delivery mechanism across the perimeter, through the fabric of your network, down to the endpoint, into an actual application. And those are actually those steps 1 through 5. So if we think about the perimeter of your network, there's a lot of opportunities to prevent this malware, to prevent this payload from coming through the perimeter with next generation firewalls doing that inspection, not just at layer 3 and layer 4, but also tearing apart layer 7 payloads as well. And web filtering, that's a great opportunity to stop outbound bad clicks. So if an email does make it through the mail filters and a user decides to click, we might be able to block that with a web proxy because it sees it's that web, that click is actually trying to download an executable file. And that's where some web proxy filtering can really help us out there. DNS filtering is awesome. Everything we do relies on DNS. It's essentially, yes, it's its own protocol. It stands on its own 2 feet, but it's really a supporting protocol. So when a user clicks, we have to have a DNS request first to convert that name to an IP address. And when somebody, there's some sort of command and control channel that might want to be established. If it's a domain name, there's going to be a DNS lookup to convert that to an IP address. So DNS filtering can take a lot of different attributes into consideration and form a confidence level if that domain should be trusted or untrusted. And there's commercial products that do this, and there's some open source products that do this as well. In my opinion, things to be thinking about are the reputation of that domain. Has it been spotted in the past delivering malware? Maybe it was infected with some sort of a botnet. How new is that domain? Baby domains are something that I believe, that's something that's less than 90 days old. Attackers will create new domains, build attack infrastructure, and use that with some phishing type campaigns. And then you've got what I would call a new domain. You get an email from a domain that has never been seen before. These are all things that come into play, build confidence, and allow you to block at the DNS level. So let's say we get past next-gen AV, we get past DNS filtering, web filtering. The next thing we can do kind of inside the network, but before we hit the host, is to evaluate what's behind a link or evaluate what's inside of a file attachment. And this can be called sandboxing. And really what we're doing here is we're building some virtual machines in a self-contained and isolated environment that won't do harm to your production network. It's highly instrumented. It's gathering all sorts of telemetry. Debug logging is turned on, and we grab those links. We see what it downloads into us. We execute files. We open attachments. We run macros. And there's all sorts of good reports that can come back to us. What's even better than just the reports that might come back to us as practitioners is the exchange of JSON or XML formatted log files, which can go straight into the SIM. So imagine we recognize that there's some sort of an attack that's going after a very specific CVE. Well, that CVE data gets pumped into the SIM. The SIM's also consuming vulnerability scan data, and it sees that, yes, this attack was aimed at server 2. It's using a very specific CVE, and on a recent vulnerability scan, server 2 is vulnerable to that exact same CVE. You can now have a correlation rule in your SIM generate an instant alert because you've got a real problem. Now, if we make it through that layer and we get straight to the endpoint, there's a number of endpoint tools, whether we call it endpoint protection, endpoint detection and response, host-based intrusion detection, host-based intrusion prevention, use of the Windows built-in firewall. I mean, there's a million different things. Whatever you're doing, make sure you're tuning these tools properly to detect things that shouldn't be happening on your network. Let's say it now makes it past all of those endpoint type tools, and we're at the application layer. A lot of ransomware begins life as a macro. And these are highly obfuscated macros that really represent a stage 1 dropper. And their purpose in life is to call out to the internet and grab that stage 2 payload, which is the actual ransomware code. So a beautiful thing, get into that application, get into the Office Trust Center, and create very restrictive settings for the ability of a macro to execute. And best of all, it can be managed and controlled by group policy. So you can deploy this across the entire organization very, very quickly. Now, if we think about...
Yes. One thing to add on that, John, I'm glad that you say that, because whenever we read the reports on trends or we read the reports on analysis, we can see that the two type of files that are most used to introduce malware organization are PDF and Office files. Because, of course, everyone uses PDF and Office files. So I'm glad that you mentioned the Office Trust Center.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you've got the ability in Adobe to not allow JavaScript to execute, to create
Correct.
some protected zones, things of that nature. So similar controls to the Office Trust Center are available to you inside of Adobe. Now, let's say somebody does click, it evades all those prevention controls. What is the attacker going to do next? They're going to do a few things. They're going to attempt to escalate privilege, and they're going to move laterally. So let's look at privilege escalation. And how we can prevent it. One of the great things we can use is the local admin password system by Microsoft. This integrates with Active Directory, and it will actually create a unique local admin password on every machine across the network. And you can set it to a ridiculously long length with uppercase, lowercase numbers, special characters, and you get to also define the rate of change. So you now can change your local admin password on every single machine every 24 hours. So the value to an attacker, if they could possibly get a hold of the hash, is very limited because it only has a shelf life of 24 hours. So these hashes, what is a password hash? Well, a hash is a cryptographic algorithm that's a one-way algorithm. You take a plain text input, like let's say my password is the word Apple, which of course it isn't because that's terrible. But so we put it through a hashing algorithm, and we've all heard of SHA-1, MD5. In the world of Microsoft, they have the landman hash, and they've got the new technology landman hash. And this ends up being stored on the local machine in the SAM database. If you're on a domain controller, it's stored in this huge file called ntds.dit, which is like a big glob of all of your Active Directory objects. And attackers, if they can grab those hashes, they're going to crack them. So the big deal here is, I know that we're all on modern operating systems. Modern operating systems don't store your hash as an LM representation, but the old ones did. So as we carry legacy protocols forward, I know you're not using it today, but you did use it in the past, whether you know it or not. And if you had a service account whose password was length 14 or less, and let's face it, NIST told us in the old days length 8 was fine. So we have people out there with service accounts only length 8. They were set back in the days of Windows Server 2003. And those passwords haven't changed. People don't dare to change their service account passwords. So now, even though the modern operating system doesn't support it for backwards compatibility, that landman hash is inside of your Server 2016 environment, whether you know it or not. So what that brings us to is cracking your own passwords. Because if you actually harvest those hashes and sort them based on the LM hash, you will see if you've got 600 people, let's say 600 total accounts to include service accounts in the organization, you're going to see probably 570 landman hashes that look identical. And what it really is going to be is a null value telling you there is no storage in that format. But the minute you see something that's different, that's when you have to, you got to run, hide the women and children. Bad things are about to happen. Well, what you really need to do is change the password on that account. Those legacy settings carried forward. The only way to get a null value is to change your password. So not only do I want you to crack your passwords, I want you to examine the hashes, and I want you to change your passwords.
Yeah, something important about that is about your disabled users, right? And you and I talk about this in the past, saying if you have a disabled user that has an element hash, that this is still in the system, one of the questions is, okay, how you know that no one is enabling that account, right? Are you managing that? And the second thing is, if you have an LM hash in that account, it's very simple to crack, one. And the second thing is very simple to do a quick search to see if there is any empty hash that is equal to that. Meaning, like, if you have the LM, I can break your password. And then if you have another account who has the same empty hash in your organization, that means that I don't need the LM for that account because I already break the password to crack on that account. And that's something that we also like to do. Compare your hashes, even if you don't have the cracking mechanism. And there is a ways of doing that with a PON database, or there is a way of actually running a report to saying how many people has the same NTE hash. Without cracking it, you at least know that you have a lot of people using the same password within the organization. That normally is an indicator of the service X maybe creating that account and not putting that they have to change it after a period of time, or maybe other indicators that can represent that.
Good question, Trey. So Trey asks, you can see his question at the bottom of your screen. And as most good IT answers, InfoSec answers, it depends. But largely the answer is yes. So if you get a ransomware infection on your computer at home and you're connected to the office over VPN, you are likely connecting to file shares at the office. It's a mapped drive letter on your laptop, and any type of network connectivity that you enjoy as a normal user is also made available to the attacker. And what we see, what we're going to see in the next slide, or maybe 2 slides, is a lot of the command and control. So ransomware operations have changed dramatically in the past year. And it's now a hands-on keyboard interactive attack where the attacker is inside of your network 2, maybe 6 weeks, doing special search and destroy missions, finding your backups, deleting your backups, and then encrypting your data. They don't just want your endpoint, Trey. They're going to pivot through your VPN. They're going to get into the data center. they're going to move laterally as best they can. And that's what we want to prevent. And that is actually the next slide. We'll talk about the prevention of lateral movement.
Yeah, let's that's a great opening for this slide. Let's move on.
Number one thing you can do is, first, workstations don't need to talk to workstations. Use the built-in Windows-based firewall to disallow workstation-to-workstation traffic. Now, maybe you need to create an exception. Maybe, right, there's the Windows deployment optimization application, which you can have peers help each other get the Windows updates. Yeah, so you allow that. But that's just an exception to the general rule. Friends don't let friends have workstations talk to workstations. So make that firewall work for you. And that can be put into play with your jump boxes, because your firewall is going to be configured to only allow management traffic into servers and into endpoints if it comes from the jump box, which you see as element 4. Now, I also want to say, if you have to get rid of SMB v1, it's very weak, and then you digitally sign SMB traffic. When you do this, you stop SMB relay attacks, which is awesome, because attackers will use SMB relay attacks to pivot their traffic onto other endpoints to gain access they normally wouldn't have. And if you disable your unused protocols, we'll think about LLMNR and NetBIOS. We'll just talk about those. They're domain, those are broadcast domain name resolution protocols. Those are getting abused all the time to pick up challenge and response hashes, crack the hashes, use the hashes to pivot inside the environment mercilessly. So you want to get rid of those. You see the 3 that are on board on the slide. There's also things like you want to get rid of WPAD, SSDP. You want to get rid of universal plug and play as well. Yeah, now, and this is right. That's prevention. We want to prevent the delivery of the malware. We want to prevent execution of that stage 1 malware. We want to prevent privilege escalation. We want to prevent lateral movement. That's the tone of this overall session. But then we have to talk about what happens if, and that's where we pivot to our talks about backups.
Yeah, and something important that a lot of our audience needs to understand is when we talk about these things, a lot of this is concept of information security 101, right? You don't have to have things in your environment running that you don't need. That's the whole purpose of disabling protocols and services that you don't require. It's a well-known information security if you want to govern thing whenever you are deploying services and devices. So let's talk about backups when we talk about lateral moves. And this is something that a lot of people has some misconceptions. As Jon was saying, a lot of these guys are going to go after your backups. So one of the questions that we want to tell you is, first of all, you have to have some level of air gap between your traditional day-to-day backups versus your weekly or monthly or however you want to do it. There has to be some level of air gap, because when a ransomware attacks works and start to move within your network, your backups are going to be one of the first targets that are going to go after it. The second thing is, if you are using any kind of drive for these backups, you can have a NAS or you can have a type of drive that you're using for this. Make sure that you are disconnecting those drives after execution. That's something that you can pretty much configure in any type of backup solution today. That's very important. So if for whatever reason, again, you are seeing this lateral move within your network of ransomware, they will not be able to hit those backups devices. And the third thing is, backups is a critical component of your infrastructure today. You have to have restrict ACLs. You have to have a very strong process about who can access these services, and also why don't you give us an idea on privileges? And I know that privilege and rights, we talk about this, Jon, on what we talked yesterday about this.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because another thing we can do to protect our credentials is to remove the debug privilege from administrator accounts. But we also really need to be very stingy in how we allow the backup privilege and the restore privilege to be used. So I recommend there's a specific service account just for backups. There's a second service account just for restorations, and you apply the backup privilege to the service account for backups. You apply the restoration privilege to the service account for restorations. You really should do everything you can to avoid having those privileges on any other accounts inside of the environment, because of the way it allows you to bypass the access control list inside of the NT file system, which is how Windows works.
Yeah. Okay, so
And now we're down to just 5 minutes. We got a couple more slides, and if we want to go over for a little bit of questions, we can as well. Do we need all of the solutions to prevent ransomware? Well, you really don't need all of them, but we have to set ourselves up for success. We have to tilt the playing field in favor of the defender and not the attacker. And we have so many different boundary lines to protect ourselves with. We have to take advantage of it. We have to be protecting the perimeter, the Ethernet fabric, the host, the applications, right? So it's all about user, application, and data. So what can we do so how do we protect the user? Credentials, labs, not having LM hashes. How do we protect the data? Well, we don't let this ransomware get to it. We don't allow untrusted code to run on the endpoint. And certainly application, we talked about those settings you can do in the Office Trust Center or inside of Adobe itself. So no, you don't need to, but I'm tilting the field in my favor because new ransomware is terrible. And like I mentioned, they're going to use command and control, CNC servers. They're going to interactively be inside of your environment for weeks on end, maybe even a month and a half. And there's a number of technologies that we talked about to prevent the delivery of malware. We use those same types of prevention techniques and technologies to prevent the command and control traffic. The big thing that's different is if they're coming at you through Tor, let's say it's port 443 to and from Tor, you can get a list of known Tor exit points. You can feed those into your SIM. You can do batch analysis of flow data and network connection data to see if you had any connections into or out of Tor in the past. That'll be a red flag that lets you orient your response towards a very specific host. That threat intelligence information can also be fed into your SIM, or it can actually be integrated with it, not even just fed in with it. There's some great open source products for threat intelligence. MISP is one of them. And if you're using things like Security Onion with Zeek and Suricata, Rich Betchlick's company, Core, I think it's Corelight, they're the parents of Zeek. They also have a threat intelligence that directly integrates with it. And when these adversaries aren't interacting with the servers or the endpoints actively, there's a back door on that machine, and it's going to beacon back to the command and control infrastructure. So you might have an opportunity by analyzing 24 hours worth of flow data to catch those beacons. And that typically, like there's a reference to your SIM, there's a Python script that integrates with many SIM platforms called Flare, and you're already feeding NetFlow into your SIM. You can run that Flare Python script and detect beaconing.
Yeah, and by the way, beaconing is when that machine is trying to communicate with a command center server and try to say, hey, do you have something for me? Do you have something for me? Are you still there? Are you still there? It's a communication that you will see constantly with certain frequency in your network traffic, for the guys that are not aware of what beaconing may be. Okay, so we're ending this today. So we want to make sure that you guys have at least 3 takeaways. I know we talk about a lot. We talk about a lot of different things that you can do to prevent ransomware. But the first one is, as you were saying, and Yesenia asked this question, defense in depth is critical. You have all these different layers that you can implement within your security posture to kind of prevent that from attacking each of these different sections that we talked: the initiation, the download, the untrusted software, the communication piece, and also the execution of that malware within that environment. And of course, the move of that malware within the environment.
And when I look at number 2, this is really the concept of assume breach, zero trust. It's a different story if you've got one computer that gets breached versus your entire organization. So imagine your laptop gets ransomware on it and you need to rebuild it. Not a big deal. Imagine every single file share across the company has ransomware on it. Nobody can get email, nobody can get PDF, Word, Excel, and all your backups are gone. So understand, this is ransomware 2.0, maybe even 3.0, and it's not just your computer. They don't want $5,000. They want your whole organization. They're going to hold you at ransom, at risk. They might disclose your data via pastebin, but they want $150,000. So it's a whole new flavor of ransomware today.
Yeah, and the last takeaway that we want you to kind of take home and kind of kind of think is this is a serious problem, but there is still a positive message here. There's a lot you can do. You know, if you prevent anything in this cycle, you're going to be good, right? If you prevent that from initiation, of course, you're going to prevent the whole thing. But as Jon was saying a second ago, if you can prevent the lateral move, at least you have a much less complicated situation to deal with than the whole problem. So there is a lot of things that you can actually do today to prevent this ransomware. And one last thing is, this is moving, this is expanding, you know, this is changing. So pay attention to how this ransomware now works, because all these things works different from time to time, and we have to pay attention of how the ransomware attacks will move to the next direction in the attack methodology.
Well, thanks everybody for joining. Hopefully this helps you stay safe from all malware and specifically from ransomware.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day and a good weekend. Bye-bye. Thank you, Jon. Have a good day.
Thanks, Andy. Bye.